You can hear your own heartbeat in the silence. The marble floor is cold beneath your bare feet. 7 people stand in a half circle behind you, their faces lit by oil lamps that throw shadows across the walls. No one speaks. A woman with gray hair and steady hands, they call her the Pranuba, takes your wrist and leads you toward a wooden figure in the corner. You were told this was tradition. You were told every bride must do this. But no one explained what it would feel like when the cloth was pulled away and you saw what waited beneath. The carved phallus is larger than your forearm, polished smooth by years of use, and mounted on a pedestal that places it at precisely the height of your hips. The Pranuba's grip tightens. Behind you, a physician adjusts his instruments. Your husband watches from the doorway, his face unreadable, and you understand, finally, that what happens next will be witnessed, recorded, and used as proof. If this kind of history fascinates you, I'd genuinely love to know. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It never stops surprising me that stories buried this deep still find people who want to understand what really happened. The woman in that room was not exceptional. Her name might have been Flavia, or Cornelia, or any of 1,000 names that appear on Roman marriage contracts and funerary inscriptions. The year could have been 150 BCE or 200 CE. The ritual endured across centuries. What happened to her on her wedding night was not an aberration or the act of a single cruel family. It was procedure, it was law, it was religion, and it was so deeply woven into the fabric of Roman society that, for generations, no one questioned it. The ritual had a name in the sources that survived. The rite of mutinous Tutanutse, a fertility deity whose wooden representation played a central role in verifying a bride's virginity and ensuring the consummation of marriage. Church fathers writing centuries later would describe it with barely concealed horror. Roman jurists mentioned it in passing, as casually as they discussed property transfers. Medical writers provided clinical instructions, and then slowly, deliberately, the practice was erased. Not because it ended naturally, but because a new moral order wanted to forget it ever existed. To understand why this ritual mattered so profoundly, you must first understand what marriage meant in Rome. It was not primarily about love or partnership. It was a legal mechanism for transferring property, establishing legitimate heirs, and linking families in networks of obligation and alliance. A Roman bride did not simply marry a man, she passed from her father's legal control into her husband's household. And with her came a dowry, social connections, and most critically, the promise of legitimate children who could inherit. Legitimacy required certainty. Certainty required proof, and proof required witnesses. The law was explicit. Marriage was not complete until consummation occurred. Legal texts refer to this as matrimonium consummatum, a union that had been physically sealed. Without that seal, the marriage could be disputed, the dowry reclaimed, the contracts voided. Roman law, meticulous in all matters of property, applied the same rigor to the female body. If a bride's virginity was in question, or if consummation could not be proven, inheritance claims could unravel across generations. The system demanded verification, and so it created a ritual to provide it. The wedding itself was a multi-stage affair. Public ceremonies established social legitimacy, processions through the streets, sacrifices at household shrines, the exchange of vows before witnesses, but the public ritual was only half the equation. What followed in private was equally formalized, equally witnessed, and far more invasive. After the bride was escorted to her new home, she was taken to the atrium, or a private chamber where the Pranuba, a married woman of good standing, presided over the next phase. The Pranuba was both religious officiant and legal witness. Her role was to ensure that every step of the ritual was performed correctly, and that the outcome could be attested in court if needed. The bride was prepared first. Slaves washed her, perfumed her skin, and dressed her in a thin white tunic. A physician, often a Greek freedman trained in anatomy, performed an initial examination. His task was to establish a baseline to confirm, as much as medical knowledge allowed, that the bride was virgo intacta. The examination was not gentle. Ancient medical texts describe the use of instruments, the inspection of the hymen, and the careful notation of any scars or irregularities. The physician's report would be recorded, sometimes in writing, more often committed to memory and repeated later if disputes arose. Then came the ritual itself. Mutinous, tutinous, or tutinous, depending on the source, was a phallic deity associated with fertility and procreation. His image, a carved wooden phallus, often life-sized or larger, was kept in certain households or provided by the pranuba. The ritual required the bride to sit upon the image. Some sources describe it as mounting. Others use euphemisms. Dedicated herself, received the blessing. But the Church Fathers, writing with the intent to scandalize, are blunt. Arnobius, a Christian polemicist of the 3rd century, describes brides being forced to sit on the wooden phallus while their husbands and witnesses looked on. Augustine mentions the practice with disgust, calling it an obscene mockery of marriage. Lactantius refuses to give details, saying only that the act was too shameful to describe in Christian writing. The purpose was twofold. First, the ritual invoked the god's blessing for fertility, a religious framing that made the invasive act seem necessary and pious. Second, and more pragmatically, it produced observable evidence. If the bride bled, if she showed signs of pain or resistance, if her body responded in ways that suggested virginity lost, those reactions were noted by the witnesses. The pranuba watched, the physician watched, female attendants watched, and the husband, standing just outside or at the threshold, was close enough to hear and later to testify. After the ritual with the wooden figure, the husband entered. Consummation followed, again with witnesses nearby, not in the room, but close enough to hear sounds, to be called upon later if needed. Afterward, the physician returned. The second examination documented changes, bleeding, tissue damage, signs consistent with intercourse. The physician's role here was forensic. He was producing evidence that could be presented in court should anyone challenge the marriage's legitimacy or the paternity of future children. The entire sequence was designed to convert the most private of acts into a public, verifiable fact. Roman law ran on testimony, and testimony required witnesses. The wedding night was not a moment of intimacy. It was a legal proceeding conducted in semi-darkness, with oil lamps and murmured instructions, where a young woman's body became the site of institutional verification. For the bride, the experience was shaped by fear, confusion, and pressure. Most Roman girls married in their mid to late teens, often to men a decade or more older. They had been prepared by mothers and aunts who whispered instructions. Do not resist, do not cry out, obey the pranuba, trust that it will end. The social consequences of refusal were catastrophic. A bride who refused the ritual or who failed its tests could be accused of prior unchastity, her family shamed, her dowry forfeited. Even if she suspected the ritual was cruel or unjust, she had no legal standing to object. Roman law granted women limited agency in marriage. They could, under certain conditions, initiate divorce or reclaim property. But those remedies required wealth, social connections, and the willingness to endure public scandal. Most women complied because compliance was survival. The husband's role was more complex than simple dominance. He, too, was under pressure to secure legitimate heirs, to protect his family's property, to conform to social expectations. Roman masculinity demanded control, but it also demanded adherence to ritual and law. A husband who bypassed the wedding night procedures risked future legal challenges. If his wife later bore a child whose paternity was questioned, his failure to secure proper witnesses could cost him his inheritance. So he participated, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of a calculated understanding that the system required this performance. The witnesses, too, were essential. Roman law placed enormous weight on the testimony of credible witnesses, and the wedding night ritual ensured a supply of them. The pranuba could testify to the ritual's completion. The physician could testify to physical evidence. Household slaves, though their testimony was often extracted under torture in legal proceedings, could corroborate timing and sounds. This network of testimony created a web of proof that was nearly impossible to challenge. A woman's word alone carried little weight, but the word of a respected matron, a trained physician, and multiple household members could determine the outcome of inheritance disputes worth fortunes. The system's genius, if one can call it that, was its integration of religion, law, and medicine. The religious framing made the ritual seem sacred rather than coercive. The legal requirements made it necessary rather than optional, and the medical involvement made it seem objective rather than subjective. Each element reinforced the others, creating a practice that felt inevitable to those within it. But the ritual's durability also depended on silence. Women did not write about their wedding nights. If they kept diaries or letters, those documents rarely survived. The sources we have are almost entirely male: jurists discussing property, physicians discussing anatomy, and Christian polemicists discussing pagan depravity. Not by accident, but by design. Roman society did not value their testimony on matters that mattered most to them. Their silence was structural, enforced by law and culture, and it persisted for centuries. The ritual began to fade only when Christianity reshaped Roman law and morality. Christian doctrine emphasized marriage as a sacrament, a union of souls blessed by God, rather than a property transaction verified by witnesses. Early church leaders campaigned against the public, sexualized rituals of pagan Rome. They framed privacy as a virtue and modesty as a Christian ideal. Over time, as Christianity became the state religion, legal reforms followed. The role of the pronuba shifted from forensic witness to ceremonial attendant. Physicians were no longer required to examine brides, and the wooden phallus of mutinous Tutinus was removed from homes, defaced, or destroyed. But the erasure was not complete. The Church Fathers preserved descriptions of the ritual, precisely because they wanted to scandalize their audiences and demonstrate the superiority of Christian marriage. Those descriptions, hostile and exaggerated though they may be, are the primary reason we know the ritual existed at all. Archaeology has added fragments, phallic votives found in household shrines, wall paintings depicting domestic rituals, inscriptions honoring women for their fertility and virtue. These pieces, assembled carefully, reconstruct a practice that later generations found too shameful to remember. What remains is a paradox. Rome gave the world legal systems that emphasized evidence, procedure, and rights. But those same systems normalized invasions of privacy that treated women's bodies as objects to be inspected, tested, and certified. The wedding night ritual was not an exception to Roman law. It was Roman law functioning exactly as designed. It reveals the cost of a legal culture that prioritized property and legitimacy above bodily autonomy, that converted intimate acts into public facts, and that silenced those most affected by its procedures. The women who endured the ritual, Flavia, Cornelia, and countless others, whose names we will never know, left almost nothing behind: no letters describing their fear, no diaries recording their pain, only the cold legal language of contracts and the hostile testimony of Christian writers who wanted to prove paganisms. Moral bankruptcy? Their silence is the loudest legacy of all. It speaks to a world where women's experiences mattered only insofar as they produced legitimate heirs and secured male property. It speaks to the gap between public celebration and private suffering. And it speaks to the ease with which societies forget what they find inconvenient to remember. The ritual's final trace is not in law or literature, but in the archaeological record. A small wooden figure, barely 6 inches tall, found in the ruins of a Roman house in Pompeii. It is unmistakably phallic, worn smooth by handling, and inscribed with a prayer for fertility. Museum curators debated for years whether to display it. When they finally did, the label read simply, "Votive object, domestic cult." No mention of wedding nights, no mention of rituals. Just the sanitized language of scholarship, preserving the object while erasing its use. The women who touched that figure, who were made to sit upon larger versions of it, who bled and wept and carried the memory in silence, they remain unnamed. But the figure endures, smooth and small and undeniable, a fragment of a history Rome tried to erase.